October 20th, 1991. Hastings, Nebraska. The body of a goose was found in the town of Hastings, Nebraska, in the local park, seemingly killed by something, or better yet, someone. The body, with its head removed and missing, and the wings torn off. A pretty gruesome sight. However, this wasn't just any goose. On the legs of the goose, a tiny set of custom-made sneakers designed specifically for him. This wasn't just any goose. This was Andy the Goose, a viral sensation born without any feet and had custom-made sneakers to help him walk. Turns out, Andy was murdered, and his murder remains unsolved to this day. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, perhaps one of the strangest true crime cold cases I have ever heard of, that, pardon my childish sense of humor, brings a whole new meaning to the words foul play. Today's episode, the murder of Andy the Goose. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host Dominic, and today's episode is kind of a goofy one, but not in the traditional sense. Normally on the show, we discuss some pretty gruesome true crime cases. I mean, just last week, we covered the case of Tim Molnar, whose body was discovered frozen in ice after seemingly vanishing off the face of the earth. That case was both perplexing as it was gruesome. Now we have covered serial killers and monsters, but today on the show we are covering an unsolved crime that kind of seems like something you would only hear about through some type of comedy cop show. The murder of Andy the Goose is perhaps one of the strangest crimes I have ever seen or heard of, especially because it is not the typical variety, but it still remains an unsolved case. Instantly, your mind might be thinking what the possible motivations are for someone to kidnap a popular goose and kill it, and we will, of course, discuss those theories towards the end of the episode. Now, just a disclaimer, I am also going to see how many goose-related bird puns that I can fit into this episode. So, just an FYI, only because when I did my research for this, they kept popping into my head, so of course I felt the need to throw them into my spiel for this week's episode. Now, of course, this is a little bit more of a laid-back one in basically the traditional sense, but like I said, it is still a very perplexing murder mystery that I had never heard of before, and albeit it's goofy in nature, it is still unsolved, and that makes it very intriguing for someone like myself, and that's obviously why I picked it for this week. Now, how today's episode is going to go is that I'm going to explore the origins of Andy the Goose, his upbringing, a little about his owner, Gene Fleming, and ultimately go into his death, and then of course wrap it all up with some other facts I was able to dig up in my research, as well as my own personal theories on this case. Now, before we talk about Andy the Goose, let's talk about his eventual owner, Gene Fleming. Fleming was born on July 30th, 1922 in Beaver City, Nebraska. When Fleming was a young adult, he would join the U.S. Army Air Corps and actually go on to serve in World War II. Now, during this time as well, he would meet his wife, Nadine Lawfer, and the two would get married in 1944. After his time in the Army had come to a close, Gene and Nadine would move to Portland, Oregon, where Gene would put his skills he learned in the Army to use as a shipyard welder. Portland would not be a permanent home for Gene and Nadine, as when the late 1940s came around, they had moved back to Gene's home state of Nebraska, notably Hastings, Nebraska. Gene would go on to work a variety of different jobs, one being a welder again, welding together grain boxes, and he would actually get into the retail business, selling clothes. Gene's son Steve describes his father, and I quote, "My dad was an awful good-looking man, and they'd take pictures of him in different suits and put them in store windows." Now, Gene's knack as a salesman would eventually land him a job as a salesman at Liggett & Myers, a cigarette company. Eventually, Gene would move away from the salesman trade and actually start his own company and become an inventor. Gene would create Fleming Manufacturing in Hastings in 1960. Fleming Manufacturing would mostly create livestock equipment, and the most notably being the roll oil cattle oiler. Now, Roll Oil is now its own company, and it is still very much still in business, with its headquarters being based in Lincoln, Nebraska. Now, the Roll Oil cattle oiler was a triangular-shaped device with multiple different appendages, and was meant to be used as a type of scratching post by cows and cattle. Well, it turns out that on these scratching posts, there was insecticides that would kill ticks, mites, flies, and any other harmful parasite or insect. And as it turns out, just a little kind of knowledge nugget for you, as it turns out, in 1959, the year before the cattle oiler was invented, the U.S. cattle industry had lost an estimated $800 million due to insects affecting the cattle. Now, I have to imagine that that number in particular has already been adjusted for inflation, and that number I actually got straight off of Roll Oil's website. Now, of course, there were insecticides available to be used on cattle at this time, but there was no effective way to ensure lasting and repeated coverage of the cattle from these bugs and insects, and the cattle oiler solved that problem. As it turns out, Gene Fleming was a pretty smart dude. Gene Fleming was also a giver, as he was heavily involved with a local charity of disabled children, and when Gene retired in the 1980s, he naturally couldn't keep still. Gene would continue his tinkering ways, making fishing lures for a time being, all up until 1988, when Gene would find a companion that would arguably change his whole family's life. And with that being said, let's talk about Andy the Goose. Gene would take a trip out to his sister-in-law's farm out in Harvard, Nebraska, where he would see a goose. Now, within this flock of geese that his sister-in-law had on this farm, one goose in particular stood out. Now, this goose was only just 2 years old, and it had the unfortunate birth defect of being born with no feet, just stumps at the end of his little legs. Of course, this would tug at the heartstrings of Gene, watching this goose struggle to chase his fellow geese around the gravel roads along the farm. Gene, the natural giver, decided that he wanted to help this goose. Now, Fleming would quote-unquote adopt this goose and his partner as well, his mate, or the goose's mate, and take them back to his home in Hastings, where he would begin the process of constructing his plan to help this goose get back on his feet. You see what I did there? Now, Gene's first idea was to try and construct a goose-sized skateboard. Now, I'm going to stop right here. I don't know why that this was option number one. I would think that the shoes were option number one and that the skateboard would come second, but I guess it's the other way around in this case. Gene's first idea was to try and construct this goose-sized skateboard with the hopes that the goose could somehow push with one foot and then pick itself up and glide on the board. However, that idea quickly was discovered that was not going to work. This was not going to work for this goose. It would not be able to figure it out. So Gene then had a better idea. He found leather baby shoes, size zeros, and stuffed them with foam rubber and put them on the goose's feet. Now, Gene's granddaughter was 12 when the goose, then who they came to call Andy, was introduced to her life. Now, Gene's granddaughter, whose name is Jessica, by the time she got home from school the day Gene picked up Andy, Andy was already wearing his shoes and running around the yard in his new kicks on his leash. Now, at first, Andy resisted the idea of wearing shoes on his feet, but once he kind of discovered that the shoes helped him finally walk again, it was almost like it had given him new life. Now, Andy's mate would earn the name Polly, and now Andy and Polly both now had permanent residence with the Fleming family. Now, Gene stated that Andy was smart enough to show gratitude for what Gene did for him by allowing him to walk, by kind of showing affection and gratitude. So Gene felt Andy was able to show gratitude for what he did, and almost like the goose was smart enough, like, hey, this man helped me walk again. I'm very thankful and grateful for him. Now, Gene stated in an interview with People magazine, and I quote, "He knows what I did, and I think he is grateful. He is a one-man goose." Now, this would just be the tip of the iceberg when it came to Gene and Andy. Gene had a friend named Gary Johansson over at the Hastings Tribune newspaper who became smitten with Andy in this story of Gene seemingly giving this bird a new life by building him these sneakers to walk around in. And Do bear in mind, Andy had multiple different pairs of shoes. Some images show him with Converse high tops and another with Nikes. Needless to say, this Goose had better style than some people I personally know. Gary Johansson would write a few lines about Andy and the story in the Hastings Tribune, and the story of Andy took off like wildfire, with everyone wanting to know more about this Goose. Needless to say, the Goose was loose. Okay? I'm going to apologize. I'm getting out of control here with the puns. Newspapers from all over the world started contacting the Flemings to do stories on Andy, and perhaps the most notable being an appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. Andy went about as viral as you could possibly go in the 1980s. In addition to this, Andy started making public appearances with Gene, and Gene would actually start taking him around and touring him around. He would, quote-unquote, goose-proof the passenger seat of his orange Triumph TR7 car, and even started an Andy fan club, of all things. Hastings, Nebraska quickly became known as the home of Andy the Goose. In addition to all of this, once Nike got wind that Andy seemed to prefer Nike-branded baby shoes, they actually sent Andy a whole crate of them, making him perhaps the only animal, and definitely the first goose, to get a major sponsorship deal. All seemed to be going well for Gene, the Fleming family, and Andy. Now, in my opinion, I think that, and again, let me just stop here before I go on and voice my opinion about this for a second. I think, and maybe this is a hot take, maybe it isn't, maybe you're kind of thinking this as I'm going through this, but in my opinion, I think that they were possibly using Andy a little bit of a cash cow in terms of his popularity, and maybe you can agree to disagree with me on this, but although I do think it's kind of justified, this isn't something like a UFO encounter or something like that we talk about frequently on the show, where you would be afraid to earn some type of money from something. After all, Gene did a good deed by getting Andy his help that he needed and helping him walk. It was a feel-good story that kind of resonated with people, and the fact that Gene was already so active in helping out disabled children, Andy was kind of a living example of the testament that a disability doesn't define who you are as a person. It is honestly an inspiring story, and I would see the reason he was so popular and famous. Although you could go back to the idea that, okay, the Goose got popular, the Goose got mainstream, now Gene's touring him around, starting him a fan club, kind of milking it a little bit. I guess that's maybe not the word, but you kind of understand where I'm coming from. And I can honestly see the fascination with a Goose wearing sneakers. I mean, it's a very cool thing, and it's something that you don't see all the time. And everyone out there has this affinity, I think, deep down in their brain, even if they don't want to admit it, they have this affinity for cool and special animals, whether they're cute, whether they're talented, whether they got some secret ability, whether they're a dog that helps out people with certain medical conditions. People always have that soft spot for animals that have these special abilities, or they're disabled and now they're going on to live better lives because they've been helped. Everybody has the affinity for this. So the idea that Andy the Goose got so popular that he did, I'm not necessarily shocked by that, although this kind of idea of Andy the Goose being milked like a cash cow will come back up later in the episode. Spoiler alert. However, the story of Andy would come to a tragic and abrupt end. On October 16th, 1991, Gene and Nadine would get a phone call while at their home. An anxious voice on the other end of the line simply said, "Is Andy okay?" This puzzled them, as this didn't make any sense. Of course, Andy should be okay. He is at home in his hutch. However, he wasn't. Two Hastings residents were out using their metal detector in one of their local parks and discovered the corpse of a goose sporting sneakers. Of course, there could only be one goose that this possibly could be. The Flemings rushed out to the hutch of Andy and Polly to find that the hutch was wide open and both geese gone completely. One thing was found at the scene of the kidnapping, and that being footprints left behind from someone. And we are talking about full-size footprints here, not little tiny goose footprints. Now, the news of Andy's death spread like wildfire throughout the community, as people could not believe that anyone could do this to a goose, of all things. It was murder, and people were taking it that way, and they were taking it very seriously. It actually made national headlines, and many of these newspapers didn't pull any punches when it came to the scene that Andy was found in. People magazine wrote, and I quote, "He was found in a heap, decapitated and skinned near the town baseball diamond. Now, if in fact that is true, this is a pretty sick and heinous thing to do to an animal that was someone's pet. However, it is important to note that Andy's mate, Polly, was missing as well from the hutch and has never been found. Now, another wrinkle in this story, perhaps, however, if you think about it, unfortunately, I am hard-pressed to think that whoever did the actions they did to Andy, unfortunately, it makes me believe that Polly must have met a similar unfortunate fate. Now, shortly after the murder of Andy, a reward fund was established to try and get any clues to the murder of Andy. Because of the press and headlines spreading about the murder, Andy's reward fund snowballed into a whopping $10,000. Unfortunately, leads in regards to Andy's case were extremely few and far between, and no updates came. Gene Fleming and the Fleming family would bury Andy at their property and in their backyard, where Andy and Gene had their first play session together. Gene pushed for answers, however, they wouldn't come. Shortly after Andy's murder, Gene started experiencing early symptoms of Alzheimer's. Gene's granddaughter, Jessica Fleming, now married and known as Jessica Corgi, has stated that she felt like Andy's presence in her granddad's life kept him with the family for longer. And she says, and I quote, "In retrospect, I think it was Andy who had kept him here with us for a lot longer." On New Year's Eve in 1999, Gene Fleming would pass away in his sleep from complications from Alzheimer's. He would pass away without having closure or without knowing who kidnapped and killed Andy the Goose. Before he passed away, Gene campaigned to get a bronze statue made in Andy's memory, but unfortunately never got the chance to get completed. Jessica Corgi has found herself in recent years circling back to the story of Andy and the unsolved murder of him. Jessica, the same granddaughter who we will dive into a little deeper here, has gone back through some old photos, fan mail, and everything the family had on Andy, and some things in the story seem to not add up, particularly with the idea that this case remained unsolved after all of these years going by. Jessica then took it upon herself to get in touch with the sheriff's office to see if there was any information being withheld from people in regards to the investigation, and it turns out there was. Now, this would be confirmed by a call to the former president of the Hastings Chamber of Congress, Don Reynolds. Reynolds would say, "About 2 years after the murder, someone from the sheriff's department called and said, 'Well, we found out who did it, but we can't tell you, and we don't want to have any news release about it.' We didn't know what to do. Finally, we donated the reward to our community foundation, which used it for kids' projects." Now, when Don Reynolds would go on to confront the sheriff's department about why the information never got out to the public about who Andy's killer was, the department told him that the person responsible for Andy's murder, and I quote, was somebody who was not responsible, indicating that the culprit could have some type of mental disability or perhaps be not in control of their actions. With us not knowing the identity of the killer and with the police withholding this information from the general public, we are kind of at a standstill from the police and in terms of the investigation about who killed Andy the Goose. Jessica Corgi, who did tell the police that she would not name the individual responsible if she was told by police, they still wouldn't tell her. Jessica is currently working on a documentary of sorts about Andy's murder, and it seems like up to this point it has not released yet, begging to question if she in fact is still making one or not. Jessica has stated that she is no longer interested in knowing the identity of the killer, as she isn't interested in retribution of any sort. But with all that being said, that is kind of all we know about Andy the Goose and his murder, and this now kind of brings me into a section before I want to discuss theories and possible killers and things of that nature. I want to dive into some other tidbits of information I found while researching this case. Now, in my research, I wanted to try and find out more about Jessica and kind of her impact on the family and her current involvement with the case, and a lot of the news articles that wrote stories about the crime of Andy seem to revolve around her, as she has taken point on telling the story and being someone that the press can speak to about said story. Now, in an article in the Vale Daily, it talks about Jessica now in recent times taking her story of Andy the Goose and running a one-woman stage show she calls Andy Interrupted. where she goes on to describe the story of Andy the Goose and the impact he had on her and her family's life. Jessica, in telling this story, has become protective of it, stating that she has tried to get trademarks on the story of Andy so that she could make her documentary, and that other content creators, most notably an Irish podcaster named Blind Boy Boat Club, has done an episode on the story and has stated a desire to come to Nebraska and investigate himself. The protective nature of other people getting involved has influenced Corgi to take the story and turn it into this type of sales-generating project so that she can, in fact, get this story trademarked. And when she started doing her shows of Andy Interrupted, she did in fact do that. So she started to generate income by doing these one-woman stage shows. And in doing this, she had hoped that this was the first step to securing a trademark for the story of Andy the Goose and eventually advancing her documentary forward. A part of her shows was revealing information about the Andy the Goose story that people have not heard about before, and it was also being something that she could use to help secure this trademark by kind of giving the audience these little tidbits to the story that these news articles hadn't reported on before, that the general public did not know about. So she was giving them little nuggets of information that only she knew, and this would obviously help her try and get a trademark to the story. Now, Jessica has had quite a change of opinion when it comes to Andy the Goose, because back during the articles that I read, Jessica actually wasn't fond of Andy, and wasn't really fond of her grandfather, Gene Fleming, either. Now, I'm of course not here to make accusations, but these articles lay out the groundwork for her slight malice towards her grandfather and Andy the Goose. Now, for context, let's rewind ourselves in the story a little bit. Jessica had actually originally named Andy the Goose after she got into a fight with a girl at school whose name was Andrea. So, of course, when Andy came into the family's lives, they were thinking about a name that would fit him, and obviously Andy was the name that would fit him, and Andy was named by Jessica after this girl that she got into a fight with at school. And they kind of felt like this was kind of like a joke, and it wasn't really something that was to be taken fully seriously, but it stuck. However, when the first stories started rolling in about Andy, Jessica was expecting to be mentioned and made famous that she named Andy the Goose. However, this wasn't the case. Gene had actually changed the origin of Andy's name to that of him being named after Andy Capp, who was a comic strip character. Now, this made Jessica angry, and she pretty much dismissed all notion of the Goose. She would actually go on to pass on the opportunity to go on The Tonight Show because of the Goose and because of her grandfather. Gene, as it turns out, wasn't a great granddad, as on multiple different occasions there was him being a prankster and trying to scare her. There was an instance where he dropped her off alone at a water park in Missouri, and there was another instance at a family reunion where Jessica and Gene went to this family reunion, that he took her there, and at this family reunion there was this giant theater production about this is kind of weird. I don't fully understand the impact here, and the articles I read kind of left this kind of vague, but at this family reunion they had this giant theater production about a distant relative of their family who was a murderer. And Jessica had no idea that this theater production was going on, and I have to imagine that she was very embarrassed by this, she was taken aback by this, and obviously Gene did not tell her about this. So, in Jessica's eyes, Gene was not a great granddad to her. But regardless, with all this going on, Jessica still wasn't fond of Andy, stating, and I quote, "I didn't really appreciate having to go to the mall while Andy was on display and have to clean up Goose droppings while my friends were at the arcade. I was an awful teenager, let's put it that way. I was not into my parents, and I totally didn't want to hang out with anybody. I really just wanted to be at home and watch Dance Party USA." Now, I've never watched Dance Party USA. I've never even heard of it until I researched this, so I don't know if it is super duper compelling, but obviously she was a big fan of it when she was a teenager. Now, in an article written in the Campo Santo Quarterly Review, The author of this article states about Jessica with the following, and this is a quote from the article, so this is a quote from the author of the article, kind of synopsing a lot of the things that I just discussed with you. And I think this whole statement is very, very compelling, and that's kind of why I chose to include it in here. It's funny to think of this 13-year-old girl living in the shadow of a famous goose, losing her spot in a parade to him, cleaning up his shit at the mall, being mortified as her grandfather builds special shoes to help him have sex, and know that in 2018, she is going to try and be the hero that the goose needs. That the quote-unquote awful teenager who wasn't around when Andy died because she skipped her dad's birthday to watch TV at home would join her grandfather years later in his curious obsessions. What would Gene Fleming have thought? Now, when asked this kind of hypothetical question by the author of the Campo Santo Quarterly Review, Jessica stated that she didn't think her granddad would be surprised that she had this change of heart, and then started saying that she was very close with her grandfather before stopping her statement and changing over to another story about her granddad. Now, you could say that that is a kind of a misdirection or whatever you want to call it. Regardless, I think that part is very notable of her just kind of changing the topic, because I think that whole entire statement that was written in the Campo Santo Quarterly Review is very truthful about the situation. And now that Jessica Corgi has become an adult and she is now, I guess, the champion of this story, it seems like she's had such a change of heart, because when she was a kid, she hated Andy the Goose. She wasn't very fond of her granddad, and now all of a sudden she is jumping on the Andy the Goose train. Now, of course, I am not here saying that Jessica hated her granddad, Gene, and that no matter what, they are still family. And you have to imagine, you of course still appreciate them and enjoy their presence. However, to me, and this is my own personal opinion, there is nothing about this story that doesn't reek of deep-rooted jealousy. Jessica was jealous of the goose. After all, her granddad had changed the origin of his name, taking credit away from his granddaughter, and the goose started being the star of the show and the star of the family, for that matter. Now, when you were a teenager, everyone likes to be the center of attention. And when you're a teenager, you like that feeling of being the center of attention. And that's pretty much a given. However, this overall story screams to me that Jessica Corgi, much like her granddad inadvertently did, is profiting off the story of this goose and his murder. She is now the star of the Andy the Goose show, not her grandfather. In a way, this could be an unintentional/intentional way of pivoting the spotlight to her after all these years of not being credited for her role in the Andy the Goose story. And with the trademark, whenever she gets the trademark, would secure her as the owner and rights to the story. And once the trademark is in, you can take this story as far as you would like to, and as far as she wants to. Books, movies, TV, you name it. The sky's the limit, and realistically, so is the profit. Gene did a good deed helping Andy, but he certainly gained some fame from it. And now, in my opinion, whether good or bad, that's kind of indifferent. His granddaughter, again, whether she's doing this on purpose or not, is doing the same. And in exchange, she is getting her slice of the attention pie while the internet attention iron is hot. Now, the Andy the Goose story has had this kind of little bit of cult following in these little tiny corners of the internet. And now that, the internet world is more accessible than it ever has been, and you have more people researching these types of unsolved cases and things like that, people are bound to find this story and find it fascinating and find it very intriguing. So, of course, Jessica is striking while the iron is hot, while the Andy the Goose story is coming back into the public's eye, and she is taking this and she is running with this. She is trying to get the trademark, and you can agree to disagree with me on this, but this is my personal opinion. But overall, this certainly seems to be the case to me. That I understand Jessica was, in a family of Andy the Goose. But she was extremely jealous of him. She wasn't fond of her granddad. And now that both of them are realistically out of the picture and she's the only one left to tell the story, hey, guess what? I'm going to go back and get my slice of the attention now by starting the Andy the Goose stage show, by trying to get the trademark and all of these other things. And I understand being very defensive about a story that is within your family. I totally understand that. But this is kind of what it seems, because she has taken such a massive U-turn, and the only reason, in my eyes, that she would make this massive U-turn is because either maybe she matured a little bit, and obviously that could be the case, became an adult, hey, I was holding on to so much resentment over this goose for no reason. That very well could be the case. But obviously she is making a profit off of the Andy the Goose story. And she wants to be the only one who can make profit off of the Andy the Goose story. And I'm not saying whether that's bad or whether that's good or whether that's wrong. But it's kind of setting herself up to put herself in a very good place financially because of this story. And you have so many little influences to her when she was a kid about this story and about how she was treated. This kind of feels like, to me, her way of getting back, inserting herself back into the story and becoming relevant again, or at least telling her side of the story. But again, this is simply my opinion. I don't know any of these people. This is not any type of character assassination of any sort, because if anything, I commend people for going out and making that money and getting that bag. I'm totally for it. Go for it. However, that's my own personal opinion on this whole matter. And I guess maybe that's a little bit of a rant, and if you didn't like me ranting there, I do apologize. But that's kind of what this seems. This whole story about Jessica bringing it back up after all of this years. But we've kind of gotten a little bit off topic here, and let's move back into the murder of Andy and the theories we have for his murder. Now, the first theory I have is titled A Family Member / Jessica. Now, this does stick out to me as a noteworthy contender, and even though Jessica might have some financial motivation for the story currently, I don't ever see her doing something in regards to harming Andy or Polly. I just really don't see it. I don't think it is a family member that could be responsible either, especially considering how much the death of Andy hit Gene. No amount of jealousy or hatred, in my opinion, could justify reasoning for killing a pet of any sort. And that's why I don't think the family did it. Gene loved Andy, and from everything I could find, so did the family for the most part. And I don't think that they were involved. The second theory I have is an enemy of Gene. Now, this theory would mean that someone who had it out for Gene could have been responsible for the death of Andy and Polly, and that with Gene's retirement, the only thing that he cared about more than perhaps his family would be Andy. Now, this would make reasonable sense, except many people familiar with the Flemings couldn't think of anyone that would want to harm Gene in such a nature, effectively ruling out an enemy of Gene's of some sort. After all, Gene was an inventor, entrepreneur, and donator. After all, he was a Shriner, and he gave back to kids in need. This isn't necessarily the character traits for someone that someone might have any spite towards, and I honestly don't think that this was an enemy of Gene's. Now, my last theory I want to go over is just what the police said: mental disability. Now, the idea of this theory is perhaps there is some truth to the idea that someone with some type of mental disability broke into the hutch and took the geese. Perhaps this is someone who had already met Andy before and because of their mental disability did not know the ramification of their actions. However, I would be hard-pressed to think that someone, even if they did have a mental disability, would basically skin this goose and decapitate him and rip his wings off. I think that's a little grotesque, to say the least. And maybe I'm wrong on this one, but that just doesn't seem like someone, mental disability or not, would torture an animal like that. But again, maybe I'm wrong. Now, there's also no statistic out there as well that shows any correlation between mental disabilities and animal abuse, which kind of makes me think that this could be someone else, but unfortunately, until the police give us a little bit more information, this is the best theory we have. Now, I think it could be someone with a disability that possibly knew Gene through his work with disabled children, or possibly maybe this was a disabled adult who had seen Andy and developed this kind of compulsive need to have him, and that led this person down the line of kidnapping the geese and killing them, possibly due to a lack of awareness, or because this person was disabled, or maybe they were narcissistic to the point they needed to kill the geese to get that type of head rush. To be honest with you, I really don't know on this one. This one's really kind of stumped to me, But again, we're left with so very little information that the police have released that it kind of leads us back in circles, back to this idea that maybe the police are right. Maybe this is somebody with a mental disability. They had found them, but they really don't want the public going after this person who has this mental disability or whatever it is. And to be honest with you, this is kind of where I keep ending up, because we just don't have as much information that the police have released on this. Kind of doesn't make me think that there's many other suspects either. Now, the story of Andy the Goose is a heartwarming one that kind of roots itself as a strange murder mystery than the ones I usually cover. And sure, Andy throughout his life was saved by Gene and his family and warmed the hearts of people all over the country. Now, I hope that we can get to a point where his story can be freely told without trademarks or anything like that. And to be honest with you, I think the infighting between Jessica Corgi and other people who want to steal the stories for themselves is ridiculous and is a ploy at a cash grab. Even though I do think Jessica's usage of the story currently is slightly wrong, she has every right in the world to tell this story and should be able to. I obviously voiced my opinion on that earlier, but I am just a small-time podcaster. But with all things being said, I think in the case of Andy the Goose, unless some type of explosion in the press happens, or maybe the documentary comes out, we won't know who killed him, or the motive behind it, and that is really unfortunate. But with that being said, that is going to do it on this week's episode of Unblurring the Unknown over the murder of Andy the Goose. I hope you all enjoyed it. This is obviously the time in the podcast where I do my obligatory self-plugs, as I like to call them. If you were listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out in the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. Please go ahead and follow me on Instagram at Unblurring the Unknown, where you can send me topic suggestions via Instagram direct message. You can also send those to my email at unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I'll say that again, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Send me those topic suggestions. I greatly appreciate it. I'm also on TikTok. Check me out. Same handle, Unblurring the Unknown. Check me out there. Check me out on all my socials. I greatly appreciate the support, and it means the world. But with all that being said, that is going to do it on this week's episode of Andy the Goose. I hope you really enjoyed it. Again, another kind of fun and different one. Not fun in the idea that this is an unsolved murder, but a very unconventional unsolved murder. And again, I hope you all enjoyed it this week, and I will see you all on the next one.